Hello and welcome back to Answering Bart Ehrman with Matthew and Samuel. And we're continuing to read our way through Jesus Interrupted. And we're into chapter 2 now, Matthew. And
we're
going to... This section is an argument that goes from page 29 right through to 35, but we're going to break it up into a couple of videos.
Yeah, it's made up of lots of sub arguments, we could say, isn't it? So we'll have to
but very popular ones too. Very popular ones that I hear around.
Yeah.
So do you want to start with our first reading on page 29?
Yeah, great. Yep. So the heading of this section is Discrepancies in the Accounts of Jesus' Birth and Life. We can now consider a number of discrepancies among the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, starting with the narratives of his birth. I've somewhat arbitrarily divided these into differences that strike me as particularly important and differences that may seem relatively minor or just curious. Again, I should stress that I am not presenting every possible instance of a discrepancy. That would take a book much longer than this one. The birth of Jesus. There are only two accounts of Jesus' birth in the New Testament, the opening chapters of Matthew and of Luke. So after that, he kind of recounts the details of each of those for a couple of pages. So we'll just skip through that. People can read the beginning of Matthew and the beginning of Luke.
So in other words, he gives a summary of Matthew's account of Jesus' birth and early life and then Luke's.
Yep. And then he gets down to his point. He says, before examining the differences between these two accounts, I should point out that the historian finds real difficulties in both of them. And then he gives us his first difficulty for Matthew. He says, in Matthew, for example, what does it mean that there is a star guiding the wise men, that this star stops over Jerusalem and then starts up again, leads them to Bethlehem, and stops again over the very house where Jesus was born? What kind of star would this be exactly?
Okay, so that's his first problem. Yep. So in this case, he's not really comparing Matthew and Luke. He's going to do that later on, but he's just saying that there's all these historical problems in Matthew and Luke. And the first is there's this star.
Yes.
There's this star which leads the Magi to Jesus.
Yep. Pretty famous example, but reasonable question. What's that on about? What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, well, I just think that, when you're reading the Bible, you are reading about, sometimes you're reading about God's miraculous events in history. Yep. And so I don't see this as a historical problem. I mean, yes, we can't control stars in that way, but there's no need to say this is a contradiction or anything. It's just saying this is a miraculous star that God brought to guide people, and that's it. Take it or leave it. It's not it's not a contradiction.
Yeah, it's not a historical problem either. It's a supernatural problem. It's an atheist's problem, basically. If you don't believe there's a God who can do miraculous things, then you won't believe this. And if you do believe in God that could do far more than we can imagine and know, then you're amazed by this, and you do wonder about kind of what it actually was and how it worked and so on, or whether that's even a meaningful question. But believing it's not a problem, you know that there's a God capable of doing it, and eyewitnesses recorded that it happened in Matthew's gospel. So not a and it's kind of a fitting way for God to speak the language of these astrologers, basically, is kind of the point of what's going on, as God invites the non-Jewish Gentiles to come and worship the Lord Jesus as well. But anyway, we're getting off track. As you say, it's not a historical
right. I mean,
problem.
So it's not a contradiction, and it really exposes your presuppositions. If you believe in a God who can send a miraculous star, well, then you just accept it. But Ehrman is saying that people, other people don't. So I don't see a problem with that. How about I read the next paragraph?
Yeah, great.
So this is his next problem from Matthew's account. He says, in terms of the historical record, I should also point out that there is no account in any ancient source whatsoever about King Herod slaughtering children in and around Bethlehem or any place else. No other author biblical or otherwise, mentions the event. It is like John's account of Jesus' death. Is it like John's account of Jesus' death, a detail made up by Matthew in order to make some kind of theological point? So Herod killing the children 2 years and younger that we read about in Matthew, he's saying, we don't hear about this anywhere else.
Yeah, well, the way he phrases it is showing his hand to start with, because he says there's no account in any ancient source whatsoever about this event. Yes, there is. It's called Matthew's Gospel.
Yeah,
and that's a historical source that you have to take as seriously as any other, and work out what's going on. But should we, as people 2,000 years removed from this event, assume that there would be evidence in a range of sources of this event that happened in one town in Judea? It's not. Atrocities happen all over the world all the time, unfortunately. They happen in villages and towns, and you won't hear about it. It won't necessarily be recorded by very many people, if at all. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yes.
It's just, he seems to be asking far too much of the historical sources, that I won't believe this happened until I have at least 2 or maybe 3 sources that tell me this happened. We've got one, and that's not enough for him to even consider that it might have happened.
Yeah. And, if your view of history is, unless I have multiple sources telling me, I'm just going to reject it, you're not going to have hardly any history.
That's right. Especially ancient history,
Yeah, ancient history. For most ancient history, it just comes to us from one source. Sometimes there's overlap from different sources, but most of it's just one source telling us, and that's okay. You just got to judge the source as you would judge any source, and as you said, Bethlehem's a small village. And so, we're not talking about hundreds of children being killed, but we're talking about just several children being killed, not a huge number. How much is that going to be recorded, But the other point I want to bring up was that this is completely in character with what we know about King Herod, because we know a fair bit about him. And he was well known to the royal Roman family, to the Caesars. And we read this, that Emperor Augustus is reported as saying, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." And the idea there is that Herod actually killed his own sons.
Right? Because they were potential threats to his rule. Yeah, he's pretty renowned for his ruthlessness. This is what Herod is reported as doing in Matthew's Gospel in Bethlehem is very much in keeping with what we know about him from that source and others. I mean, killed his own sons, ordered that when the one that strikes me the most actually is when he was soon to die, he ordered that leading figures from all over his realm would be locked up, and when there was news that he had died, they should all be slaughtered, because then the nation would mourn his death, even if they weren't mourning for him. I mean, that's the kind of guy we're talking about. So it's, if you're talking about would this fella do this horrendous act, he did things like that. Quite a number of things like that are recorded, actually.
Yeah. And so, it's in character with what we know of Herod. So there's no reason to doubt it. There's no evidence against it. It's consistent with his character. And that's it. So let's move on to our next point. Now, his next point, if you can read for us the third problem that we're going to consider for today, the third historical problem.
Yes, so he says the historical problems with Luke, so moving on to Luke's Gospel now, are even more pronounced. For one thing, we have relatively good records for the reign of Caesar Augustus, and there is no mention anywhere of any of them of an empire-wide census for which everyone had to register by returning to their ancestral home. But how could such a thing even be imagined? Joseph returns to Bethlehem because his ancestor David was born there. But David lived 1,000 years before Joseph. Are we to imagine that everyone in the Roman Empire was required to return to their homes of their ancestors from 1,000 years earlier? If we had a new worldwide census today and each of us had to return to the towns of our ancestors 1,000 years back, where would you go? Can you imagine the total disruption of human life that this kind of universal exodus would require? And can you imagine that such a project would never be mentioned in any of the newspapers?
Okay.
So the census.
The census here. So there's two issues he's got. He's
Yep.
got, first of all, let me get this up here. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And his first point is, from history, we don't know of the Romans taking an entire empire-wide census. And so, that he's saying they did take census. So he's not arguing that they didn't take census, but, it's the scope of it. I guess in reply to that, I would say that Luke is living in an area where there are Persians off to the east, and then there are the Arab tribes down sort of to the south, and then there's the Roman world off to the west, and he's sort of, sort of at a bit of a point where all these sort of are near each other. And I think he's just talking about the Roman world near him. He's just, it's all the Roman world around where I am. I think that's as far as we just need to go. And he's contrasting it to other parts of the world. Yeah. What do you think?
It sounds reasonable. Well, he is certainly talking about the Roman domains as he perceives it. At very, like, it's not a precise reference. He's saying that it was this census ordered, and so all the people of Israel had to go home. It's not at all like what he describes on page 33, where he says, if we had a new worldwide census today and each of us had to return, like that's not how it was. We're talking about places that people could generally walk, even it would take quite a bit of time, but they could walk there, and not a mobile society where people emigrate constantly to different places for jobs and that kind of thing. It's just not like that at all. We're talking about a society where people did know where they came from, where their tribe identified with, and they went back to places like Jerusalem regularly for things like Passover festivals and the like. So it's the implausibility of it that he's kind of portray just isn't the case. This kind of movement of Israelites around their nation is, it's a very plausible thing. And in fact, it's more than plausible. We've got evidence of other things, which I think you're going to bring up in a moment here.
So I guess just with our first point, though, that I think Luke is just talking about the Roman world just around him.
Yeah. And
so, he's talking about Syria, and it's broken up into sections, and he's talking about that. And so I don't think Luke was talking about Britain, what was happening over in Britain or somewhere else. He's talking about the Roman world around us, the whole Roman world around where Jesus is.
The Near East,
Now, with what you were saying before, absolutely, because Ehrman sort of, he makes derogatory statements. How could people go back to their land? And, do you know where you came from 1,000 years ago? Well, the Jewish religion had as part of their identity, for the Jewish person, their identity was what part of the land was their inheritance from God. And so for Christians, you'll know these types of maps, that the promised land, land of Israel, was broken up into tribal sections, and each tribe knew their section, right? But it's even more than this. So people did know where they came from the land. And it's even more than this, because every 50 years, people were meant to go back to their hometown, right? It's called the Jubilee year. And so we're reading from the Torah, the law of Moses, and we read this: consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property, and each to his own clan. So I would even argue that, anywhere within the Roman world, the number one place where this would be possible, right, is in Israel.
Yeah.
right? So Ehrman's saying, oh, how could people know where to go back? Why would they do that? Well, the Jewish religion had as part of their religion that you were meant to know what town you came from. And every 50 years, you're expected to go back there. So again, if there was anywhere in the Roman Empire that this could happen, it could actually happen in Israel.
Yeah, and the other thing that fits well with that is that we know that the Romans, part of their strategy with conquered peoples was to kind of make use of the customs of the people they conquered.
Yeah.
Whether it was religious or cultural customs or whatever, as long as they could preserve their rule. And so if this was a thing that they'd witnessed Jews doing, it's very much likely that they would do a similar thing to be able to kind of take an account of how many of them there are and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll bring up another fact here. So this book collects ancient documents. So ancient parchments, ancient papyrus, and the author, Adolf Daisman, has gathered together these to give context to the Bible, to give other examples of things that we see in the Bible from outside of the Bible. And so this is a great book. And in it, let me get it up for you here. There's this parchment, and it's from a Roman prefect in Egypt. And it's his document that is written. And so it's his original document from AD 104, so very close to the time of Jesus. And this is what it says. Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, saith, the enrolment by household being at hand, it is necessary to notify all who for any cause whatsoever are outside their homes to return to their domestic hearths. Now, a hearth is like your oven, so it's like the kitchen, the center of the house.
Yep.
And my point with this is that we've actually got evidence that the Romans at around the time of Jesus made people all go back home.
Yep. There it is in another setting.
Setting. So, look, probably don't need to do much more on that one, except, to say Bart is trying to say that before he even compares Matthew and Luke's accounts of Jesus' childhood to show how they're all, discrepancies between them, he just wants to say they're historically implausible, right? But we've just gone through these, and all of these points are completely plausible.
Yeah, that's it. It's very easy to kind of ridicule something, and it doesn't take any effort. You can just sort of say, look at this story. This doesn't make sense, does it? But you actually look at it and engage with it in a more serious way, and there isn't any problem there. We'll see what differences he alleges there are between the accounts next, and see if there's more weight with that.
Yeah. All right. So look, we'll see you all next week, where we're going to look at the reign of Quirinius, the governor of Syria. And that's a famous example that's often brought up against Christians for the Bible being historically inaccurate. And so we're going to show you some surprising things there. So we'll see you next week.